Anunnaki Council of 12 in early dynastic city-states. It was formerly believed that in the early dynastic period, all the city's land belonged to the temple and was administered by the Ensi, city ruler, governor, as the bailiff of the city deity. More recent research gives an extraordinary picture. It is likely that in the original village settlements, all land was community land from which all families received an allotment according to their needs. Part of the land would also be set aside to maintain the shrine of the community's deity and the priests who served there. Nevertheless, in primitive societies, religious functionaries can exercise powerful sanctions by their ability to manipulate divine decisions, and this would favor the temple priesthood gaining disproportionately large allotments of land. Moreover, primitive people feel that once something has had a god, it has become sacral and must henceforth be set apart from everyday use. Consequently, land once allotted to the deity would come to be thought of as distinct from the shared pool of community land, and thus separated off as the permanent property of the temple. There were also factors leading to other parts of the communal land coming into the permanent ownership of particular families. When plots were first allotted from the communal land, the more powerful families would ensure that they received the most favorable allocations, and once having taken all the best land, they would be loath to let it go back into the general pool for a redistribution, which could only be to their disadvantage. Eventually, it would be in the interests of all the most influential families to adopt as a legal principle that land was the hereditary property of the family currently holding it. Families could, and sometimes did, sell their land. In such an event, a senior member or group of members would act for the whole. A third landowner was the state, as the Ensi and his family. In the Sumerian view of things, the Ensi ruled because he was the human representative of the city god, and that status gave him the opportunity of taking over, not always without opposition, some of the temple lands to support his functions. Thus, in some circumstances, some of what had been temple land became state land. For the middle of the third millennium, we know less about lands in state or private tenure than about temple lands. Temple lands were of three categories. The first, known as the Lord's Field, was used to supply the needs of the temple itself, including the cult. The second category was land allotted to laborers, administrators, and artisans of the temple estate in return for their service to God. The rest of the temple land was let out on a sharecropping basis, for which rent equivalent to 1/3 of the crop was paid, partly in silver and partly in kind. As Lagash grew wealthy by trade and the ruler's power increased because of the stable dynasty, it underwent economic and social changes which some populations viewed as abuses. The major complaints were two. First, the Ensi was treating the temple lands and God's possessions as his property. Second, citizens were subject to excessive taxes. Taxes were, for example, levied on cattle, fisheries, sheep shearing, betrothal, divorce, and burial. The economic developments also produced a class of wealthy men who used their wealth to oppress the poor. A rich man might make a poor man a loan and then foreclose at an inconvenient time. When the poor man proved unable to repay, the creditor would seize in settlement an animal or other goods of value far exceeding the amount owing. Economic reforms. These economic problems, combined with a power struggle between the temple authorities and the city-state administration, ended the Ur-Nanshi dynasty. 13 years after that dynasty, there came to power Ur-Inimgina, who attempted to eradicate the abuses which had arisen. We have several inscriptions of his in which he records the abuses and lists his reforms designed to protect the poor from victimization. The houses and the fields of the Ensi, the houses and the fields of the Ensi's womenfolk were joined side by side. These were the practices of former times. When the god Ningirsu gave the kingship of Lagash to Uru-Inimgina, he set up for him the divine decrees of former times. He made the goddess Bau queen of the houses and the fields of the Ensi's womenfolk. However, Lagash was too far gone in decline. These reforms were not sufficient or soon enough to restore economic strength and stability, and Uru-Inimgina fell victim to the perennial rivalry between Lagash and Umma. The latter was now closely tied to the powerful city-state of Erech, with whose support the king of Umma, Lugal-Zagezi, finally overthrew Uru-Inimgina shortly after 2400 BC, at the beginnings of imperialism. Lugal-Zagezi was an early imperialist. He embarked upon a policy of military conquest which ultimately brought all Sumer, not at first Akkad, under his control, with Erech as his capital. He also claimed to wield influence well outside Sumer, from the lower sea, the Persian Gulf, along the Tigris and Euphrates to the upper sea, the Mediterranean, so that all rulers of Sumer and of independent countries bowed to his arbitration in Erech. How far this claim accords with the truth is questionable. Probably it is an idealized picture, not necessarily entirely according to political realities. It shows that in the 24th century BC, an ideal was current of internal peace under a suzerain powerful enough to check all rivalry, and external peace through a ruler of such influence that he was accepted as an international arbitrator. Lugal-Zagezi's political expansion was not an entirely recent phenomenon. Since the time of Akka of Kish, there had been fleeting attempts at hegemony over vast areas. For example, during the reign of Ur-Nanshi's second successor, Eannatum, the forces of Mari on the middle Euphrates had penetrated almost to Lagash, 400 miles to the southeast. Lugal-Zagezi aimed more permanent domination of Mesopotamia, which he seemed to achieve when he successfully attacked Kish, still the leading city in northern Babylonia. The Sumerian king list tells us, Kish was smitten with weapons. Its kingship was taken away to Erech. In Erech, Lugal-Zagezi became king and reigned for 25 years. Lugal-Zagezi was overthrown. Erech was smitten with weapons. Its kingship was taken away to Agade. In Agade, Sharum-Kin, whose father was a gardener, cupbearer of Ur-Zababa, an earlier king of Kish, became king and reigned for 56 years. Sargon of Agade. Sharum-Kin, meaning the king is true, better known as Sargon, is Semitic. The latter word should probably be used, as here, as a technical term for a language of a particular group. Where use is made in this book of such phrases as Semitic peoples, Semites or the like, it is to be understood that this is a convenient shortening for peoples who spoke Semitic languages, implying no ethnic presuppositions or theories about race. An Arabic proverb says, "The desert is the cradle of the Arab, and Iraq his grave." This recognizes that successive waves of Semitic-speaking peoples have moved from the west into Mesopotamia, assimilating into the existing population throughout history. We had already seen that Semitic speakers were one element in ancient Mesopotamian civilization from its very beginnings, before 3000 BC, and that by 2900 BC the Semitic element was so prominent, at least in the north of what was to become Babylonia, that the Sumerian king list gives Semitic names for most of the rulers of the first dynasty of Kish. By 2600 to 2500 BC, tablets from Abu Salabih near Nippur in central Sumer bear many Semitic names, including about half the scribes who wrote those tablets, in Sumerian. There is no evidence from the century before Sargon, reigned 2371 to 2316 BC, for anything in a Semitic invasion, and such Semites as arrived during that time probably came in as individual families, settling in the Sumerian cities and rapidly adopting Sumerian culture and loyalty to their adoptive city-state. We know directly of Sargon's antecedents from what we are told on the Sumerian king list already quoted. This is supplemented by traditions in legends, of which the most important is preserved only in cuneiform copies of the first millennium BC, although in literary origin it probably goes back to the early second millennium. The legend is presented as though told by Sargon himself, and has been called a pseudo-biography. It reads, "I am Sargon, the mighty king, the king of Agade. My mother was a high priestess. I do not know my father. My paternal kin inhabits the mountains. My town was Azupiranu, which lies on the bank of the Euphrates. My mother conceived me and bore me in secret. She put me in a reed basket. She made it watertight with pitch. She left me to the river from which I could not get away. The river took me along. It brought me to Aki, a water drawer. Aki, the water drawer, drew me up when he dipped his bucket in. Aki, the water drawer, brought me up as his son. Aki, the water drawer, put me to his garden work. Ishtar came to love me through my garden work, so I exercised the kingship for 55 years. This composition must have had some purpose. It may have been written to entertain a story about an already famous hero, edify population groups who saw Sargon as their ancestor, or boost a ruler who wished to present himself as in the mold of the great Sargon. Whatever the purpose was, it would not have been achieved unless it is a framework for Sargon conformed to existing traditions about him. The essential framework of the legend tells us this about Sargon. His father was unknown. This need not imply illegitimacy, but only, since in Semitic society the descent is defined by the male line, and the longer the more honorable, that his forebears were nobodies. The legend is saying obliquely that Sargon's birth was not insignificant. His mother may have passed on to him royal blood, perhaps even, from her relationship to the god, an element of divinity. The legend then brushes aside the insignificance of Sargon's paternal descent by a theme that combines religious belief and folklore. His mother, it tells us, was an Entu, a high priestess. Now, an Entu was from the cultic point of view the wife of the god, and in human terms invariably of noble birth, and often a royal princess. A legend glorifying a historical figure cannot disregard known facts, but it can reinterpret them most favorably to the hero. Having explained that Sargon's birth was far more exalted than formerly supposed, it now turns to Aki, the water drawer. The name means, "I poured out," and it looks like a name invented as suitable for a water drawer. Since the legend found it necessary to introduce such a foster father to explain how Sargon began as an irrigator and gardener, we accept that historically Sargon was an irrigator and gardener. The Sumerian king list confirms this by saying, his father, word damaged and restored, was a gardener. King list says that he was the cupbearer of a former king of Kish. Was he? In Akkadian, the word for cupbearer is saku, and a word with precisely the exact spelling means irrigation worker. The same word in Sumerian does not denote these two officials. It looks as though the compiler of the Sumerian king list, written in Sumerian, mistook an Akkadian tradition which said that Sargon was an irrigation official of Ur-Zababa, and wrongly rendered it to say that he was his cupbearer. Everything then ties up. Sargon was of insignificant descent. His people came from the middle Euphrates. He was brought up as an irrigator, and because he did this successfully, which is what being loved by his goddess implies, when his family moved southeast into the territory of Kish, he entered the royal service, becoming the senior administrator in charge of the irrigation system so vital to Babylonia. This would have involved him in organizing large bodies of men. After the downfall of the last king of Kish, he used the administrative organization he had built up to develop his authority, and, by installing himself at Agade, a deserted site on a branch of the Euphrates, he created a power base without running up against vested interests within existing northern cities. With his tribal links, he could reinforce his new city with his relatives. Agade is the usual but possibly inaccurate rendering of the name of the city which Sargon founded as his capital. The Semitic spelling is Akkad, which may have meant the ancestral town, and this term became used not only for the city but also for North Babylonia as a whole. The city is still unidentified, although it was probably near to its ultimate successor, Babylon. The Sumerian king list gives no hint of thinking that Sargon's succession supplanted a Sumerian dynasty to a different ethnic stock. Indeed, Sargon himself accepted the Sumerian cultural heritage. His first action after defeating Lugal-Zarghezi was to display him as his prisoner before the great Sumerian god Enlil in his city Nippur, in recognition of the theological principle that only Enlil at Nippur could legitimate a king, and he explicitly claimed that it was Enlil who had given him victory. He named Sumerian deities in his titles, and his daughter not only bore a Sumerian name, Enheduanna, but was a high priestess, En, of the great moon god Nana in the major Sumerian-speaking city of Ur. Though it endured for little more than a century, the dynasty Sargon founded left a permanent imprint on Mesopotamian society. Sargon tells us he won 34 battles, taking cities stretching from Ur in South Sumer to Ebla in North Syria. The latter, now Tel Mardich, has been excavated since 1974, and the results show how far Sumerian culture had spread from its home region of southern Mesopotamia. The finds included over 10,000 inscribed clay tablets of about the time of Sargon, obviously heavily dependent upon the Sumerian writing system and Sumerian literary forms, although using a West Semitic language distinct from the Semitic language Akkadian spoken in southern Mesopotamia. Sargon exercised a deliberate policy of centralization. He destroyed the walls of cities within South Mesopotamia, depriving potential rebels of strongholds. However, he certainly did not engage in a vendetta against Sumerian influence, and he seems to have left many of the former governors in their posts, subject to transfer of allegiance to him. There is even some evidence that he reinstated the defeated Lugal-Zarghezi as governor in his original city, Umma. Sargon indeed says in an inscription that citizens of the city of Agade exercised government throughout South Mesopotamia, but this means only that as governorships fell vacant, he filled them with his townsmen. International trade flourished under Sargon, and he claimed that his control reached from the Persian Gulf to the Mediterranean, the cedar forest, the Amanus, and the Silver Mountains, the Taurus. His influence may have extended even further to the northwest, to judge by traditions in later texts, which tell of an expedition he made to protect a Mesopotamian merchant colony deep in Asia Minor, probably near to Kayseri in Central Asiatic Turkey, some 600 miles from Sargon's base as the crow flies, and far more by any practicable route. In the interests of trade, Sargon made his capital a major river port, and he tells us that ships from Meluha, Magan, and Tilmun moored at the Key of Agade. Dilmun, as already mentioned, was Bahrain. Magan was somewhere not precisely identified near the Straits of Hormuz at the southern end of the Persian Gulf, and Meluha probably represented the contemporary Indus Valley civilization, sometimes called Harappan after one of its best-known sites, in what is now Pakistan, nearly 2,000 miles by the sea route from Sargon's capital. Turkey to Pakistan was a vast trading empire for the 24th century BC, the achievement of a man who began as an irrigator. Equally remarkable with Sargon was his daughter, Enheduanna, the world's first poet known by name. She wrote, and in most cases signed with her colophon, several hymns in honor of the temples of Sumer and Akkad and the goddess Inanna, Inin. Some of these works are discussed later. We even have a picture of this lady on an artifact from Ur. Sargon remained active throughout his long reign of 55 years, and even as an older man he put down a rebellion. He was helped in this by maintaining a standing army, if that is the meaning of an inscription which says of Sargon that 5,400 soldiers ate in his presence daily. Two of his sons, Rimush and Manishtushu, successfully reigned after him. They also faced revolts, which must have been on a large scale, to judge by an inscription of Rimush which speaks of killing over 12,000 men in a rebellion of Kazalu, a city in northern Babylonia. It may be pointed out that Kazalu was as Semitic as Agade itself, so that this rebellion was not a matter of Sumerians against Semites. These two rulers maintained themselves and extend their empire eastwards into southwest Iran. Manishtushu may have died in a palace revolution. Naram Sin. After Sargon, the other central figure in the dynasty was his third successor, his grandson Naram Sin, 2291 to 2255 BC. He is frequently mentioned in later omens and proverbial sayings, usually very obscure. For example, the east wind is a wind of prosperity, the friend of the divine Naram Sin. This presumably relates to a tradition about an ancient incident in some campaign by Naram Sin, but it is not significant to us. Some of Naram Sin's inscriptions, and later ones about him, place the sign for God before his name, and there are even inscriptions in which he receives the title, the God of Agade. So great was his prestige that he was divine. Another title newly introduced by Naram Sin was King of the Four Regions, a claim for universal dominion. This was not merely an empty boast. Some centuries later, poetic composition tools the magnificence of Naram Sin's times, speaking of mighty elephants and apes, beasts from distant lands, jostling in the great square of the capital. This suggests trade relations with the Indus Valley civilization of Pakistan. According to his inscriptions, Naram Sin inflicted a military defeat upon the king of Magan, a claim given credence by finding alabaster vases on which were carved the words, Booty of Magan. This implies that Naram Sin controlled the length of the Persian Gulf, since Magan was somewhere at its southern end. Naram Sin penetrated what is now the Kurdish mountains in the northeast, quelling the hill tribes and setting up a great relief carved high in the rock's face. To guard the route into Asia Minor, he built a magnificent castle at Tel Brak in eastern Syria, and another at Nineveh, and a stele of his has been found as far north as Diyarbakir in Turkey. Mesopotamian literary tradition gives a mixed judgment upon Naram Sin, treating him on the one hand as a great hero and on the other as an ill-fated ruler. The adverse side of his reign is reflected in a religious tradition that tells of the goddess Inanna deciding to abandon the capital, Agade. Also, his inscriptions mention a general rebellion of the principal cities of Sumer and Akkad. This is emphatically not seen as a revolt of Sumerian cities against a Semitic dynasty, since the rebels contained both Sumerian-speaking and Semitic-speaking cities in the alliance. A Sumerian text traces the origin of the evil fate which eventually befell the land. Its opening lines describe the early splendor and wealth of Agade, to which came people from all quarters bearing their tribute. It was an impious deed of Naram Sin which brought this to an end. His offense was that he allowed his troops to sack and loot the Ekur, the temple of the great god Enlil in the holiest of Sumerian cities, Nippur. For this desecration, Enlil brought down upon the fertile lands a barbarous race from the hills, the Gutians. These savages disrupted communications and trade, broke down the irrigation system, and spread famine and death throughout the land. Not all of Sumer and Akkad had been guilty of an offense, and to turn aside Enlil's wrath from the innocent cities of the land, 8 of the senior gods undertook Agade should itself be destroyed in requital for the violation of Nippur. They achieved the enduring desolation of Agade by a curse reminiscent of Isaiah's execration of Babylon some 1500 years later. In sober fact, the consequences of Naram Sin's policies were not as sudden and catastrophic as the Sumerian poem suggests. Although Gutian raids on Mesopotamia may well have begun during his reign, the central authority finally broke down not until his son and successor, Shaka-Lishari, a name meaning king of all kings. Despite the traditions, the Gutians were only the beneficiaries and not the primary cause of the downfall of the Agade dynasty. The actual cause was the pressures resulting from the sheer size of Naram Sin's empire and the conflicting interests of the many peoples in it. Even in the 19th century AD, the Ottoman Empire, with several centuries of administrative experience behind it, frequently found it impossible to maintain its authority over the whole of the same area, from the Mediterranean to the Persian Gulf. The Gutians. A period of anarchy succeeded the Gutian invasion, laconically summarized in the Sumerian king list. Who was king, who was not king? King list names 21 so-called kings of the Gutian period, but the extremely short reigns attributed to them, about half with 3 years or fewer, make it likely that they were tribal chiefs who held office in rotation. Later tradition remembered the Gutians as barbarians, suggesting a primitive social organization where kingship may not have existed. There are indications that later Gutian rulers were becoming assimilated to Mesopotamian culture. The names of some later kings are Semitic, and dedication inscriptions show they had adopted the religious cults of the land. The later peoples of Babylonia remembered Gutian dominance with abhorrence as a time of barbarism when the gods were not respected, temples were plundered, and neither women nor children were spared. In the northern part of the land, Akkad, the impact of the Gutians was felt most severely. In Sumer, several of the old city-states, despite suffering material damage in the first wave of invasion, remained virtually autonomous. One city which suffered the least was Lagash. This city, destroyed by Lugal-Zarghezi, had been rebuilt during the prosperous days of the Agade dynasty. It now recovered much of its earlier prominence, particularly since the destruction of Agade had removed its principal rival as a terminal for seaborne trade up the Persian Gulf. Its Ensis extended their authority beyond their city-state, forming a new dynasty known from their inscriptions although unmentioned on the Sumerian king list. The best-known ruler is Gudea, whose inscriptions give us much information about his activities. He claimed to be suzerain to Nippur and Erech, and even undertook a campaign to loot the Elamite city of Anshan in southwest Iran. Commerce was more critical than conquests, and his inscriptions, although principally concerned with his piety in temple building and fulfillment of his duties to the gods, contain many references to trading expeditions. Once again, the Persian Gulf trade flourished, for Gudea claimed that Magan, Meluha, Gubi, and Tilmun brought tribute. Their ships came to Lagash with timber. Stone, bitumen, and gypsum were brought in shiploads to build the temple of Ningirsu, while other imported goods included diorite from Magan, cedarwood from Lebanon, copper from the Kimash in western Iran, and gold from Hahu in Asia Minor. The wealth channeled into Sumer through Lagash reinvigorated the entire country and brought the re-emergence of other independent city-states, so that by the time of Gudea second successor, his grandson, some of these overshadowed Lagash. The ruler of Erech, Utu-Hengal, 2120 to 2114 BC, could overthrow the last of the Gutian rulers, for which he was duly recognized at Nippur as King of the Four Regions, a title introduced by Naram Sin, and was included in the Sumerian king list. This marks the re-emergence of centralized government. Subordinate city-states were ruled through governors, who recognized Utu-Hengal as overlord.